Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. In this video, we will look at allowance for impairment of trade receivables, which also known as allowance for doubtful debt and provision for doubtful debt. Before we continue, first we need to understand the conservatism or the prudence concept in accounting. According to the concept, accounts should be prepared with caution and high degree of verification, which means that we really need to include everything so that whatever we present to the users of financial statement, they will get the most accurate and meaningful values. The concept also requires us to record all probable losses when they are discovered, which means that we need to forecast potential expenses that are probable. Probable here means it is most likely or almost certain and is expected to happen. First, let's see why do we need to provide allowance for impairment of trade receivables. Let's say we have this much accounts receivables. Some of them may not be able to pay. This is due to bankruptcy or death, or simply they just disappeared. Applying the conservatism concept, we need to forecast how much accounts receivables that we will not be able to collect. First, we need to identify the balance of our accounts receivables. Then we need to estimate how much debts that we probably will not be able to collect. This can be done by referring to past data or referring to other companies in the same industry. Then we will do the allowance for impairment process. The allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be treated like a liability, where any increase will be credited and any decrease will be debited. So when do we need to provide such allowance? Let's say we started our business on the 1st of January 2007. When we close the accounts at 31st December, an adjustment for allowance for impairment of trade receivables shall be made, and this will be done at every year end. Let's look at the first year end. The information that we need is the balance of accounts receivables as at 31st December 2017, which is now given 6,100, and the estimated allowance for impairment of trade receivables, which is 10%. We need to provide allowance for impairment of trade receivables 610. To record this, we need to compare it with the previous allowance, which is 0, because we just started our business and we don't have any allowance for impairment of trade receivables. So what we need to do is to debit increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables and credit allowance for impairment of trade receivables. The debit increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be treated as your expenses. Let's look at the next year. The next year we have a higher accounts receivables of 8,000, but we choose to maintain the allowance at 10%. As a result, the allowance for impairment of trade receivable as at 31st December 2018 will be 800. Here, there is an increase of 190. So, we will record it at debit increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables 190 and credit allowance for impairment of trade receivables 190. Here you can see that 600 plus 190 will make the balance of allowance for impairment of trade receivables to be 800. Again, the increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be treated as your expenses. For the year ended 31st December 2019, the accounts receivable balance is 7,000 and the allowance to be provided is also 10%. So we need the allowance for impairment of trade receivables to be 700. Here there is a decrease of RM 100. So we need to record it like this. Debit allowance for impairment of trade receivables, and the amount decreased shall be treated as a revenue in your statement of profit or loss. As you can see, the amount of trade receivables will be adjusted at every year end. Any increase will be treated as an expenses and any decrease will be treated as your revenue. Let's look at how it affects the statement of profit or loss and the statement of financial position. The statement will be presented side by side so that you can see the effect from year to year. Let's first look at 2017. The increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be expense off in the expense part, and the allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be 610 in the current assets. In 2018, since we want to increase the allowance for impairment of trade receivables, we will need to expense it off 190, and the allowance for impairment of trade receivables will now be 800. So to see the relationship, the 610 here, for you to increase it to 800, we need to add another 190. So any addition to the allowance will be treated as expenses. For 2019, we want to reduce the allowance for impairment of trade receivables by 100, so that the balance of allowance for impairment of trade receivables will be 700. So this time when we want to reduce it, it will be treated as an income. As you can see from here, 800 reduced by 100, and then the allowance for impairment of trade receivables will now be 700. Let's continue with one example. Let's say as at 31st December 2019, the total account receivables is 100,000 and the opening allowance for impairment of trade receivables is 7,000. One of the customers did die and he owed us 5,000, and the company decides to provide 10% allowance for impairment of trade receivables. First, we need to write off the amount due from the customer that has just died. This can be done by debiting the allowance for impairment of trade receivables and credit our accounts receivable. Credit accounts receivables simply means the accounts receivables have decreased. Debit allowance for impairment of trade receivables means that we are utilizing the allowance that we have provided. As mentioned earlier, any increase will be credited, and when we utilize it, it will decrease, so it shall be debited. Next, I will show you how to calculate the increase or decrease in allowance for impairment of trade receivables. First, we need to know the net accounts receivables by taking the accounts receivable balance and minus it with the uncollectible debts, 5,000. So we are left with 95,000 account receivables. Next, we will calculate the allowance for impairment of trade receivables by taking the 95,000 net account receivables and times it with 10% the allowance rate agreed. This will result the allowance for impairment of trade receivable as at 31st December 2019 should be at 9,500. Next, we need to calculate the closing allowance for impairment of trade receivables after considering the uncollectible debts. Since we have utilized 5,000, we have a balance of 2,000. The uncollectible debt should be the same with the previous one. Then we shall compare the closing allowance for impairment of trade receivables with the amount that we want as per the rate. So 2,000 compare with 9,500. We need to increase the allowance of impairment of trade receivables by 7,500 after considering whatever we have utilized. Now let's look at the journal entries. To do this, since we have already calculated the allowance for impairment of trade receivables value to be increased, we need to debit increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables, which will be expense of, and credit allowance for impairment of trade receivables, which is the amount that we want to add. Lastly, let's look at the statement of profit or loss and the statement of financial position after the adjustment. So in the expense part, we will include the increase in allowance for impairment of trade receivables by 7,500, and in the current asset part, we will include the allowance for impairment of trade receivables, a balance of 9,500. That's all. Thank you. Assalamualaikum and have a nice day.